I was sitting in back looking around and thinking, these people are coming out this evening to listen to not a very cheery topic of religious trauma. And I'm just so deeply grateful because your presence here says that you care about it. And that's a big deal to me personally. So, huge welcome. Thrilled to be here. Grateful. I would like to start by reading my story. I can tend to ramble, and so especially when I start talking about my life, and I found that reading my story is a much better way to do it. So I'm just going to take a minute to read a little bit about my life and what brings me here tonight. I laid completely alone on the floor of the church basement, shaking uncontrollably, nauseated, curled into a fetal position. I was 25 years old. I was waiting to hear my sentence from the pastors of my church. I had been sexually abused by one of their team, a powerful pastor, 18 years older than me, married with several children. I was single. He had groomed me and sexually abused me for 9 months. He told me not to tell anyone or he would shoot himself. He had left the state, no one knew where he was, so I was there waiting to face trial. What would they do? Would they blame me, protect me, throw me out, help me try to heal? This memory is one of the most vivid from a period of my life full of extremely painful memories. How did this happen? How did a place that should have been safe, a place that had given me a full and happy life, a social network, meaning, purpose, a place of belonging, opportunities for leadership and development, how did it become a place full of terror, shame, and abuse? From the time I was 19 until I was 25, I had given this group of pastors a huge amount of trust. I respected them. I had deep affection for them. I listened to them. They spoke for God. So when I came to them and told my story of what had happened, what had taken place, what happened? They blamed me. They viewed it as an affair. They were angry with me and said it and showed it. They said I was a threat to every married woman. They said I needed to leave the church, basically everything I had built my life around and everything meaningful to me at that point, so the pastor and his family could heal. They had me stand up in front of the congregation and tell 500 people that it was my fault, that I'd been involved in an emotional affair. In the months following, it is hard to describe the extent of my brokenness and profound confusion. My reputation and identity had been completely shattered. I had no idea who I was anymore. I grieved the life that I'd been forced to leave. I became profoundly depressed and went through severe panic attacks. In the years that followed, I still had no idea what had happened to me. This was 1990, and nobody was talking about spiritual abuse. It took me 3 years to realize I'd been sexually abused. The understanding of spiritual abuse took much longer and was much, much messier. I've realized that in the overall impact of what happened to me, the sexual assault probably accounted for 25% of the damage done to me. 75% of the damage had to do with the way the pastors dealt with it. That is what created the greatest trauma and the most devastating spiritual destruction for me. In the last 32 years, I have married, become a mom, become a mental health therapist, done the roller coaster of major faith shifts, sorted out the catastrophic damage done to me emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And I have healed. There's hope. Yeah. In each of the areas of my life that have been damaged or destroyed, goodness, grace, and transformation have taken place. I now have the consistent privilege of walking with those whose lives have been injured or broken at some point by spiritual abuse. And my friends, that is why I'm here tonight. This is why I care. This is why I care about this topic. It's why I do what I do every day in my office and dealing with people, and that's why I'm happy you're here tonight. Tonight's divided a little bit into two parts. I'm going to speak for the first part. Fasten your seatbelts. This is going to be fairly dense material. I have an online course that's 6 hours on this topic. I cut 2 hours off for this evening, so you'll only get 4 hours of this tonight. Joking, don't panic. We're going to go quickly through some definitions, and then in the second part, we're going to get to the substance of how religion and trauma intersect and what happens to the brain. Okay, it's a complex and wide-reaching topic. This is just an introduction, so let's get going. First of all, let's get some definitions to the word trauma. It's been used several times tonight already. Let's define this word. The Cambridge definition says it is severe and lasting emotional shock and pain caused by an extremely upsetting experience. First of all, you guys need to know that there's going to be handouts in the back. With everything you see up here, I'm going to have on a hard copy handout. So for those of you here tonight present, you'll get a hard copy. For those of you online, thrilled that you can sneak peek a little bit. So just so you know, you don't have to take notes real quick to copy some of this. The American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. We are getting more and more informed as a society about trauma. Many of you have probably even heard the word, hopefully have heard the word trauma-informed. That has been incredibly helpful to raise consciousness as a society. We understand these. There's a lot of types of trauma that we do understand. Military combat, medical trauma, like cancer, for instance. I'm a cancer survivor, went through that trauma as well. Bullying, sexual assault, physical assault, terrorism, traumatic grief, natural disasters, public humiliation, and there's all kinds, the list goes on and on. Racial unrest, all of these things are so significant, and we're learning, oh, this causes problems in a person's psyche. It causes problems in their body a lot of times. The problem is we don't often understand religious trauma. So there's this big broad umbrella of trauma, but when this happens in a religious context, it gets a bit messier. So let's talk about defining some of those. Religious trauma, this is my definition, and it's really basic, but I think it's what it is. Religious trauma is psychological trauma that happens in a religious context, often connected to religious or spiritual abuse. And we'll get more into that later, too. Alison Stone, who's written a lot on religious trauma syndrome, defines the syndrome as a set of symptoms ranging in severity experienced by those who have participated in or left behind, important list, authoritarian, dogmatic, controlling, and insular religious groups and belief systems. So this is painting a little bit more of a picture of what religious trauma might be looking like. Mental health professionals it makes me so happy that I'm seeing a continued increase in the mental health world of seeing how do we respond to religious trauma? What is it? Even in the last 3 to 5 years, I don't know how many of you have kept up with this whole arena, but I've been watching really carefully since 2003 when I knew this is where I was going to go. Still, 2003, nobody was talking about it. There was very little out. And I was determined to describe and define what is this thing. And in 2014, there was a real shift. Some important things happened in our society, and the awareness of what religious abuse and trauma began to escalate. And then in the last 3 to 5 years, even more so. So significant that we as mental health therapists and especially as ministers, I was a pastor's wife for many years, I have a heart for the ministry, was a missionary, that we understand what this is as well. I want to describe spiritual abuse. So there again, hang on here. We're just going through a bunch of definitions here for a minute. I want to define spiritual abuse, and this is a longer definition that's in my book that I created if I was trying to describe it the best I could in the most concise way. By definition, any abuse consists of some type of power differential. This is important, okay, where one person has more power than the other and hurts the other person with that power. This is true of spiritual abuse. This power can be perceived or real. This power can be held by one religious person, a small or large group of religious people, or the power can be held by the implicit rules of the whole organization. This is really important. The core of this is the abusive person or institution has some sort of power that the abused person does not have, and they use that power, usually leveraging God or religious ideas, to manipulate, control, hurt, exploit, suppress, silence, or weaken the other person. There's going to be handouts available on this as well. There's so much content around religious abuse that we're not going to go with tonight, but there's some core things that are going to be available in the handout. And this definition is one of them, and an explanation in the handout of what do power differentials look like. They can look like a role you play, gender, race, sexual orientation, money, educational level. The list is long. So these are all ways one person or group has more power than another. So with spiritual abuse, we often think of sexual abuse with it. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember back in the 80s, and all of us Protestants were like, oh, those horrible Catholics, look what they're doing. And I remember back then going, the sexual assault is all through the Protestant church as well. And it's getting covered up as well. Yes, and now we know, unfortunately, that was the truth. And so we tend to think of spiritual abuse, and my story has that element in it of the sexual assault. But there are many domains in a person's life that can be exploited and controlled. And that's the essence of abuse and trauma. It can be psychological. That is always the starting point. The psychological games, how religion is structured to control, to coerce, to manage. So psychological is the core and the foundation for which all the other abuses happen. There can be physical abuse. We don't often think of this, but I won't name names. I don't generally do that publicly, but there's a big documentary series that came out 5, 6, 7 years ago about a very intense, very large, well-known cult, and people were being hunted down physically and dragged back to the compound. So physical, it can happen physically. Social, this is a huge one. When people who have power control your social support, when they can cut off friends, relatives, institutions from your life, that is an incredible form of abuse and control. And then sexual abuse, inappropriate sexual activity or words of any kind. That's a broad category. Financial. So much exploitation happens financially in abusive systems. People get ripped off. They get coerced out of their money. And the spiritual impact is so profound. This is what part of what is so unique about spiritual or religious abuse is the damage it does to our relationship to the divine. Sometimes the obliteration that happens in our relationship with God. Before we go much further, I want to talk about a spectrum. It's a very easy, I think all of our minds tend to be a bit all or nothing in certain ways. And we talk about religious trauma, and it's easy to say, oh yes, I was traumatized, or I was not. Or I was abused, or this is an abusive institution. This one is not. I'm going to challenge that and say, let's put this on a spectrum. Let's look and say, first of all, my both psychological and theological bent says we're all pretty mixed bag. All right, we've all got a mixture of things going on, mixtures of motivations. So do the institutions that house people and that have people as a part of them. So I don't want comparisons. That person had it worse than me, so my abuse or my trauma probably wasn't that big a deal. Or the opposite, mine was so bad, you're fine. You know, we don't want any of that. And I don't want all or nothing thinking about churches, institutions, or even people. Even people. There are stories I hear about very abusive spiritual leaders, and even I, teaching this, want to say, oh, they are just evil, you know, because you hear the stories and the destruction. And I just want to challenge us to take a breath and go, whew, everything's here on a spectrum. It's a mixed bag. And to hold all of the truths of that. Does that make sense? You guys tracking on that? Because sometimes it's hard. We just want to go, this is a good institution, this is a bad one. And be able to go, good, now I have that in a category. It's messier than that sometimes. Okay, now we're going to start talking about brain function. And this gets really important for trauma in general, but specifically as it relates to religious trauma. What happens to our brain when we go through abuse or trauma? It changes the physical structure of your brain. Physically, it can change what neurons are more activated, what brain matter is developing where in your brain, what's getting used, what neural pathways are getting used over and over and strengthening. And so this is really important. There are two important parts of the brain when we think of trauma. One is the limbic system, and the other is the prefrontal cortex. They can go by several names. I'm going to use those tonight. The prefrontal cortex is up here. It's that frontal lobe up there, the orange spot. And it is, organization, planning, analysis, synthesis, problem solving, social skills, good or poor judgment, executive function. That's this part of the brain. We need this for good human life, to make decent decisions throughout a day. We need to have this firing well. That's the goal, is that on a regular day, when life's going on normal, this part of the brain, this front part of the brain is fully engaged and uninhibited. The problem is with the limbic system, it is deep under this purple area. I couldn't find one with a good showing all the limbic units that work together to make the limbic system. But it's back here in the back part of your head. And it is the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn part of our brain. So it is here, it is the reactive part of our brain, and it is there to keep us safe. That's its job. It's there to sniff out danger and to react immediately. So you fight, anger, you know how it goes. Flight, get me out of here. Some of you, because we're talking about trauma, could feel any of these tonight, honestly. Freeze, be still, let it go away, to freeze. And to fawn, they've kind of put this new word in this list, and I think it's very true, this placating, over-pleasing part of us interpersonally when our limbic system lights up and we just instinctively react. Now, here's the messy part. The degree to which this limbic system is activated is the degree to which this prefrontal cortex is shut down. So this is a problem. So people with trauma often live much of their life having their limbic system chronically on, chronically activated. The goal of healing and therapy is to get that limbic system calmed down and to get the prefrontal cortex back working, clear thinking, good judgment, able to organize, able to concentrate, all those things that you don't feel when your limbic system is activated. In an evolutionary sense, the tiger chasing us, the limbic system is for that. You fight or you flight. You run fast or you fight hard. And it's meant to be, bam, ignite, and then, whoo, tiger's dead. All right, we're done. Okay, let that calm down, all right? And we stay activated. In our culture, we stay constantly. There's constantly a vague tiger back here with the chronic stress. So this is the problem we get with trauma in the brain. I'm going to go over some triggers. So what we're going to talk about now are traumatic triggers. And these can be you, it could be the people you're helping, the people you're working with, the people you love. So we're going to define what a trigger is and then tie this together a bit. Triggers are events or external stimuli that reactivate trauma. So something out there that reminds me of trauma. Stressors connected to the original trauma that can set off anxiety, panic, depression, anger, rage, emotional or mental shutdown, and other types of psychological distress. I use the illustration of a made-up veteran from Afghanistan. Let's say you've got a veteran who has come home from the war, and they have been in combat, they've been traumatized, they've got PTSD, their limbic system's pretty hot. But they're enjoying a Sunday afternoon, sitting around a table, playing cards with their family, having a really good time, and playing cards and chatting, and outside a car goes by and backfires. And before Dave knows what his body is doing, he's under the table. Instinctive, physical, limbic hit. Bam! Under the table. We get that, right? We can look at that and say, well, yeah, you've just been in combat, you've been around explosions, your brain is just struggling to deal with the trauma of what you've been through. So with Dave, he's got these immediate physical responses to trauma: a rise in heart rate, a rise in blood pressure, perspiration, face flushing, shaking, freezing physically, involuntary tears. Okay, so those are physical things that can happen when a trigger hits our brain. The reaction emotionally or socially can be withdrawal from an emotional interaction, shutdown, sadness, numbness, flashes of anger or lashing out, feeling out of control, freezing emotionally or freezing socially, feeling alone or abandoned, high fear, panic, or anxiety, and speeding up, moving and talking faster, or need to escape or leave. When a trigger hits our system, this is a little side note, but I think it's important. Science has told us it is at minimum 45 minutes until our body's chemistry is restabilized and it's back to normal. So when Dave goes underneath the table, he's going to have 45 minutes until his adrenaline and cortisol levels are stable, his whole endocrine system is back in line, and he's not having some of this reactivity. And that's an important thing for us to be gentle with ourselves when we do get triggered, and with people. It's going to take some time. How you all doing? This is kind of heavy stuff, and it's dense. You hanging with me? Okay. Grateful for those of you online as well, hanging with me here. Now we're gonna take what we've learned here and how does this apply to religious trauma. The story of Dave, we get. Most of us are trauma informed enough to go, Dave, don't worry about it. It's good. We get it. No problem. You heard a backfire. It reminded you of a gunshot or an explosion. You know, it's cool. The problem is when it comes to religious abuse, the triggers get very, very messy and very complicated. It's not a car backfiring. That we understand. It's things that we used to love. It's things that we used to be profoundly significant to us, so important and meaningful. So what triggers are unique to religious abuse? Church buildings. Church services. I had a client who was a staff pastor, and he was trying to get back into church after months of not being able to get into a church building. He said, I can't do it. My whole body starts freaking out. And my advice to him was stay away. But, you know, sometimes there can be a lot of pressure to be like, but I'm supposed to be in church, or I want to be in church even. He said, well, I went back to church on Sunday. I said, wow, how did it go? And he said, well, you know, I think it did okay. I did go right to the bathroom when I walked in the door and vomited. Now, as a good therapist would be, so tell me more about that. I did this. Oh. Because that was the last thing his system needed. It broke my heart, but he felt pressure to get back. He felt pressure too soon to re-enter. This is a messy one. Prayer. Both private and public. It was a beautiful prayer that was shared up here earlier today. I'm tuned into this, partly due to this. I was like, oh, beautiful prayer. And for as beautiful a prayer, there could have been people out there that feel their heart rate go up, and it's a traumatic trigger. The Bible. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that experientially, not that I would have had problems with that ever, but if I did, there were years I could not touch a Bible. Years. And I went to an institution or two that was a pretty big deal about the Bible. Raised conservative does that. And so the Bible was a huge trigger for me. I won't tell you which version, but one version in particular. And it was just, it grieved me because it used to be a love. It used to be a love. I have 2 theological degrees. It used to be a love. And I went through years of having to distance myself. Religious music. Oh, when you used to love to come to church and sing at the top of your lungs, and now it makes you sob or makes you want to throw or break something. Specific religious words or ideas can be jolting. Liturgy can be a huge trigger. Men in leadership anywhere, especially if you've had a patriarchal background in church. Christian or religious people in general can be triggers. Pastors, priests, religious leaders. Do we even want to talk about religious talk radio? I don't know. We won't go there. Church signs. I'm not talking about those either. Ooh, those don't trigger me. They just annoy me. Religious books or retail items. Triggering. Social media, websites, blogs, Facebook posts. Any number of other things connected to the trauma. Things like communion, Eucharist, smells in church. Okay, this is the meat that I want you to understand for you if you've been through it, but also for those that you love and care for and are helping. You would not ask Dave, say, hey, Dave, I'm going to walk, come with me. It's by a firing range, but I'm sure you'll be okay. No, you wouldn't do that. You'd say, no, we're going to walk someplace quiet. It'll be fine. But in religious contexts, these triggers, for so many of us, are beautiful and good. And we say, you should move toward those. But they're not. They're not good for some people's brains. It hurts them. And so that person sits here profoundly confused about why, when I still think I have a relationship with the divine, why can't I pray without freaking out? They provoke strong reactions of guilt or shame. And they scare us. They can be really scary to have this strong reaction to something you used to love. And in certain circles, they can cause social rejection and disapproval. That's rough. There's a handout I have in back on managing triggers. I almost feel a little unethical talking about the triggers without trying to wrap it up a little bit, but there's some good stuff. There's ways to manage this. There's ways to get your heart healed up. What we're describing here is a trauma response or even post-traumatic stress. And here's what's hopeful. A traumatized brain can heal. PTSD is actually a hopeful diagnosis. There are interventions that can actually heal that brain now that we know. You don't have to live, and those you love and work with don't have to live out of the limbic part of your brain the rest of your life. That's hopeful. It's wonderful. I want to go ahead and invite the musicians up here while I close. They're going to play some beautiful music. Why have I chosen to talk about this tonight? There's four things that immediately come to mind. One, because I want as many people as possible educated. Education is the foundation for us understanding what's happening. I want people healed. I want people compassionate toward those who've gone through this. And I want you all equipped to help others. And that's my hope for this evening. Healing comes to us in a lot of different ways, and music in my life is definitely one of those. And this song that's going to be sung is a beautiful healing song, and it can be a prayer for us and for those that we love and care for and serve. May God love you like you've never been loved before.